Good afternoon. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event on the Federal Reserve's big inflation fight. And it's my particular pleasure to welcome our highly distinguished panel of experts. In the order in which they'll speak, they're Kevin Warsh, Bill White, and Don Kohn. I can't think of a better panel of speakers to address these very important and topical issues. I'll conclude the panel with some of my own remarks. Now, it would be a gross understatement to state that there has been a lot of economic change since March this year, when we last discussed the Federal Reserve's economic policy challenges. Inflation, both at home and abroad, has proved to be anything but transitory. Indeed, we now have inflation running at multi-decade highs, last experienced in the early 1980s, and at multiples of the central bank's inflation targets. The Fed's earlier statement that inflation is transitory have joined its 2007 view that the subprime problem is contained as memorably bad forecasts. Now, in response to inflation's surge and spread, the Fed has now shifted to a hawkish monetary policy stance. It has increased interest rates 3 times in unusually large 75 basis point steps, and it is now committed to withdrawing market liquidity through quantitative tightening at the unprecedented pace of $95 billion a month. In response to last month's disappointing inflation numbers, the Fed is giving every indication that it intends to continue raising interest rates and withdrawing market liquidity in large steps. Financial markets have not reacted well to the Fed's newfound monetary policy religion. The US equity market has declined by some 25%. The bond market has lost some 20% in value, and the cryptocurrencies are down about 70%. Mortgage interest rates have more than doubled, and many now forecast we'll see significant house price declines. At the same time, the dollar has surged by around 15% this year to a 25-year high. Meanwhile, the world economic outlook has darkened considerably. It has done so as a result of multiple factors that include Russia's invasion of Ukraine that is causing acute energy shortages in Europe and international food price increases. Then we have China's zero tolerance COVID policy that has put an end to that country's rapid economic growth. And we have a strong dollar and high interest rates that have increased the stress on the emerging market economies. It has to be of concern that cracks are now showing in the international credit markets. Evergrande and some 20 other Chinese property developers have all defaulted on their debt. The Bank of England has been forced to intervene in the gilt market to prop up the country's pension system. Italian bond spreads have begun to widen again, and the emerging markets have started to default on their debt. It's against this background that I'm looking forward very much to hearing our panelists' view, especially on the following questions. First, is the Federal Reserve on the right track to bring down inflation, or might it be engaged in monetary policy overkill that will produce an unnecessarily hard economic landing? Second, the Fed, along with the world's other major central banks, are now engaged in synchronized monetary policy tightening after a long period of synchronized monetary expansion, which led to asset and credit price market mispricing. Might this be raising the risk of a global financial market crisis? Third, the Fed's monetary policy tightening has resulted in a surging dollar, which is adding to inflationary pressures abroad and exacerbating the ability of the emerging markets to service their debt. How concerned should the Fed be about the impact of its policies on the rest of the world economy? And finally, in light of the Fed's recent policy mistakes, what lessons should we draw about what might be needed to prevent a future episode of high inflation and asset price bubbles? How big should the Fed's balance sheet be? and what asset should it be holding? So without further ado, I'll hand it over to my good friend and former AI colleague, Alex Pollock, who'll moderate in his inimitable fashion this panel.
Thank you, Desmond. Thank you. And let me add my welcome to our distinguished panelists and to everyone joining us today. Well, here we are again. Yet once again, we find ourselves in interesting financial and economic times, as the saying goes. Looking back to our last conference in March of this year, the conference on the Federal Reserve and the everything bubble, Desmond said this, quote, "The Fed has got itself into a most unenviable monetary policy dilemma. If it were to raise interest rates aggressively now, it might succeed in getting the inflation genie back in the bottle. Might. But it would do so at the price of bursting today's everything asset price bubble." Good call, Desmond. As you pointed out in your introduction, first, the leading central banks in synchronized fashion all combined their printing presses and adopted the same theory of QE, and together gave us the global everything bubble in stocks and bonds and cryptocurrencies and houses. And now we know the everything bubble is painfully deflating with very many trillions in lost market values as markets correct from their bubble inflated prices. Just to mention a few examples, the financial writer Wolf Richter recently published a list of 1,001 stocks whose prices are down 80% or more from their peaks. The Federal Reserve itself has a massive mark-to-market loss on its own balance sheet, which Paul Kupiec and I have estimated the loss in market value is $1.3 trillion as of mid-October. Moreover, the Fed has this month started to make large operating losses in addition to its mark-to-market losses as its cost of funds rises above the low yields on its QE fixed rate bonds and mortgage securities. And as Desmond mentioned, cryptocurrency prices collapsed by 70%, and the UK pension funds had their own bond market panic. And now houses, by far the biggest asset class in the world and by far the biggest component of personal net worth, have their prices starting to fall in what the Economist calls a global house price slump. Our AEI colleague Ed Pinto recently counted that 51 out of the top 60 US metropolitan areas now have falling house prices. What is that the beginning of? We have to wonder. To add to this, the IMF is already urging debt relief for distressed emerging country debt. So I think we can say that the cost of the everything bubble is truly coming home to roost. Now, one of the favorite questions I like to ask people is, how much can an asset price fall? And the answer I always propose to this question is more than you think. Given all this, as Desmond wrote in a recent letter to the Financial Times, might the Fed be inviting a global market crisis as it raises rates at this point? This is a relevant question, but it arises, interestingly, when interest rates are not even high, historically speaking. The average Fed funds rate over 7 decades, measuring from 1954 to 2022, was 4.6%. So even with another bump upwards, if it does happen at the November Open Market Committee meeting, we're not up to average yet. And 10-year treasuries yielding 4% or mortgages at 7% are hardly remarkable, historically speaking. And they're certainly nowhere near Volckeresque in their levels. And indeed, real short-term interest rates are still deeply negative. So have we developed financial structures that can't even stand normal levels of interest rates, historically speaking? And a final question that occurs to me: have we reached the real nightmare of all central bankers? And this nightmare is the thought that Mises, Hayek, and the Austrian school may be right after all about the inherent flaws of central banking. Now, addressing our current interesting times calls for rich experience in monetary issues, wide perspectives, and depth and clarity of thought. And we are most fortunate in having a panel which brings all of these to us today. Kevin Warsh, Bill White, Don Kohn, and Desmond, speaking in that order, will take up the challenges and risk posed by the combination of continuing inflation and asset price deflation. Each panelist will speak 10 or 12 minutes. After that, we're going to give them a chance to react to each other or to add or clarify points. Then we'll take up questions and answers. For your questions, those of you in our audience, please email them to beatrice.lee, that's L-E-E, at aei.org, beatrice.lee@aei.org, or tweet them to hashtag AskAEIEcon. As our discussion continues, we'll get to 3:30. At that point, we will adjourn. I think this is bound to be an enlightening, if not an uplifting, discussion today. And Kevin, you have the floor.
Hey, Alex, thank you very much for putting me in this. I'm going to hide my own picture, see if I can do that. So I'm looking at you guys and not myself. There it is. The thing that I enjoyed most when we convened, Alex and Don and myself and Desmond, now with the addition of Bill last time, is it was an intellectual feast. And that's really what we're in this for. This is a time of great peril for the US and the global economy. And it's great to be able to speak among friends and former policymakers to ask ourselves from the cheap seats now, what would we do in these circumstances? The robust discussion we had last time was, I thought, quite informative. And I would hope that our colleagues at the Fed and other central banks are having this kind of robust discussion. I will say, by the time they come out with their dots and their forecasts and speak in the public square, I feel like much of that robustness has disappeared. So I'm just trying to take comfort that it's happening behind closed doors. When we met 6 months ago, we forewarned of many of these troubles. And I think we spoke out when we thought it could do some good. So we'll try that again as we meet here in October. In March, the inflation rate was in the high 7s. And I, like some of you, suggested the Fed forecasts were wrong and the institution was poorly positioned. As we meet today, I'd say I still have cause for significant concerns. Their action in the last 6 months shows some improvement, some learning by doing, but they would have been better served to take, I think, the full course of recommendations that many of us had, not just 6 months ago, but frankly, years ago. So I thought what I might do is just highlight 4 themes I mentioned 6 months ago. If it's not too rude, give a bit of a report card on those 4 themes, and then to be constructive here, give 4 new recommendations to our brethren at the central bank. So the first theme 6 months ago, as I said, inflation is a failure in the practice of economic doctrine. I talked about the intellectual failures, institutional failures, operations, and risk management failures. And as I sit here today, while policy seems to be getting on the right track, those errors come from not from a lack of intellect, but a lack of curiosity, a lack of imagination, a lack of humility about what the risks are around that forecast. They seem still to this day, in my view, to be relying on recent periods to judge whether their policy is right, rather than the broad swath of history that many of us had studied. They seem to be passing through various stages here. First, denial that inflation was at all going to be permanent, then excusing it. It was because of wars and pandemics, then rationalizing it as it found its way into the body politic, and now finally to act. But I asked in March what I'll ask again, do they understand what inflation is and where it comes from? Do they understand the transmission mechanism through which their policies, the policies of the rest of government, can affect inflation? And there I remain skeptical. At some very simple level, if you subsidize demand and constrain supply for long enough, then I don't know what you should expect other than the inflation we're seeing. And for a long time, supply on the supply side of the economy has been much constrained by monetary policy, keeping rates too low for too long, and for non-monetary policy. And that discussion, I think, could handle a more fulsome view. Again, 6 months ago, we talked about the remit of the Fed, and we discussed that the dual mandate really had complementary purposes, not warring purposes. And I think the Fed has come around to that idea. We've heard Chairman Powell talk about price stability as the condition precedent for its other objectives. And so that's an encouraging sign. But it's still not obvious to me whether in their forecasts, when they see that a higher unemployment rate to the tune of 4 or 5%, it's not at all obvious to me that that kind of unemployment rate or that kind of model will do the Fed's work for it, do the heavy lifting to bring inflation down to where it belongs. So again, I think those fundamental intellectual questions haven't been answered by the central bank or by many central bank watchers. Second, 6 months ago, I said that inflation is a choice for which the Fed is chiefly responsible. That's something to which they let their guard down in recent years. So I'm encouraged they're now taking ownership. Less blame, though we still hear it, on the war and the pandemic. But with the passage of time, inflation has become more embedded in households and businesses and expectations. Blaming others at this late date strikes me as really besides the point. When they blame others, it makes it sound as though they aren't in control of inflation. It also makes me think that they still really do believe that if COVID really is in the rearview mirror and the war were to end by some miraculous purpose, that inflation would go back down to target. I'm skeptical on that point as well. Strikes me the Fed has really lost its North Star, and they're struggling to reset their bearings. They have the zeal of the converted, as they now make repeated references to Chairman Volcker. But I wonder, and I think in some days when markets are up a couple of percent, markets wonder whether they have the conviction of the monk. And the question, I think, remains for market participants: will the Fed engage in a new sort of quiet quitting of its inflation objective? They won't admit inflation is going to go anywhere but 2%. But in the back of a lot of people's minds, the question is, but won't they really be accepting of some higher level? Again, 6 months ago, I made a third proposition. I suggested that inflation was among the most significant economic policy errors in the last 45 years. The rapid tightening of policy they've had to do in the last 6 months into a war, into a global recession, shows the marks of failed policy priors. In my view, the status quo ante does not exist. Their nostalgia for some pre-COVID, pre-war time does not exist. The idea that we can go back to an economy or an equilibrium of inflation at 1.7 or 2% is going to be far harder to take care of. Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke, even Don Kohn said repeatedly in my time that recoveries don't die of old age. They end with policy errors. Put differently, recoveries are murdered. Well, this one's a doozy. Inflation is doing considerably more harm to the economy than interest rates, in my view, at this point. And in their goal to achieve price stability, because of the belatedness of their policy and begrudging acceptance of what was happening, not only is price instability a question, but so is financial stability. And as history will tell us, when you have periods of high inflation, periods of financial instability, then you also often have periods of societal instability. And I think none of us need reminders of what those risks are. Let me go to a fourth proposition, if I might, Alex, and then I'll be a little bit more prescriptive. In the fourth proposition I had about 6 months ago to this group, I said that regime change by the Fed in 2020 was a catalyst to the surge in inflation, and that a regime change would be required to get rid of these inflation risks. Now, certainly they've changed rates between March and the present, but that is not the full mark of regime change. I'll have more to say about that in just a moment. I worry that they underestimate the scale and scope of the challenge in front of us, and I worry that this is a bit of a revenge of history moment. When Don Kohn and I, in various times in government, were stuck with financial instability risks in 2008, when this Fed were confronted with massive instability risks in 2020, you could see the urgency. You could see the speed by which they moved. And here, while interest rates have certainly moved up quickly, boy, they don't seem too urgent about it all, debating each meeting whether to do 25 or 50, showing us new dots. Why is it that the reaction to financial instability happens in weeks and the reaction to missing their inflation target by a factor of 4 has taken months, if not years? So what to do about it in what might be, in some sense, a time of war for households and businesses that are struggling with this? In some sense, this is the kind of war footing that financial institutions faced in 2008 and the global economy faced in March of 2020. So what would they do about it? First, I'm going to give you my favorite quote that I think is appropriate. Winston Churchill in 1942, amid the war, was asked about post-war planning. He gave a few answers, then he replied with the words that the Fed should recollect today. I'll quote here. I hope these speculative studies will be entrusted to those on whose time hangs heavy, and that we shall not overlook Mrs. Glass's cookery book recipe for jagged hair. Well, what was in that cookery book recipe for jagged hair? Churchill reminded us. First, he said, she instructed, catch the hair. I would suggest the same thing here. Catch price stability for opining upon what exactly you're going to do next. Second prescription, again with a warlike theme, this time I'll use Napoleon. Napoleon said, in war, moral power is to physical power as 3 parts out of 4. As applicable to our time and to our profession, credibility is to policy action as 3 parts out of 4. The Fed over the period of months and recent years have given transparency a very bad name in my view. They have a poor record of their forecasts. And so my quick recommendation is like it was months and years ago, they ought to jettison these forecasts. They are not providing too much forward-looking information. They are canceling market signals. And perhaps most important, they continue to appear to make it more difficult for the Fed to react to ongoing data. They should jettison the dots, quit the forecasting, at least amid this period, and put their attention where it belongs, which is getting the policy right. Third of my 4 recommendations for this crew, and this one really is a follow-up to regime change. Incrementalism is not serving them or the economy well. Part of regime change wasn't just about changing rates. It was changing the cadence of their policy, the form of central bank actions. Desmond asked at the beginning, Alex followed up and suggested that somehow policy was synchronized by the world central banks. I'll take the other side of that. Policy is being followed, but not synchronized. I would recommend on each of the Sundays that have passed in the last 18 months, and again this upcoming Sunday, that they put out a statement from the G7, the G10, the G20, whoever they could get to sign up to this. And what it would do is it would show there's a regime change in the conduct of policy. By doing this, they could change the cadence and the expectations that have now found their way into boardrooms and kitchen tables. And that statement would be simple. We, the members of the G20, and for those that don't want to participate, they need not. We believe that inflation is a clear and present danger to the global economy, full stop. In the coming hours before Monday markets open in each of these important financial and national capitals, they would then each announce their policies. They would each know in advance what the others were going to do, much like Don and I found in the dark days of '08. Then they would consider those to set their own judgments. In so doing, they could take a lot of the volatility out of the foreign exchange markets. And rather than going meeting to meeting and waiting for one mediocre data set to another, they would ask themselves each, I think, a simple question. What is the least amount that we expect to raise rates in the next 4 to 6 months? Just do it. Get it over with. At this late stage in their process, it strikes me that some degree of pain is inevitable. The suffering is optional, and they seem to be prolonging the suffering unnecessarily.
Kevin, just a reminder, you're out of time as you come to your last recommendation here.
And that takes me to my final recommendation. Thank you, Alex. The most important part of all of this is the Fed as an institution. We've seen institutions in common parlance fall by the wayside in how they're perceived to be credible. The Fed is deserving of the most protection. The Fed has an important role as a unifying institution and symbol for a badly fractured republic. As long as people think the Fed is doing technical economic work and largely achieving its objectives, they're going to leave it alone. But if the Fed is perceived to have been granted a roving commission, where price stability is just among all of its myriad objectives, then I am afraid that the Fed is going to be in harm's way. So I'll end with a simple summary of this, Alex, by saying, the Fed has followed what is the trends. The trend for years was that there was a free lunch to be had and zero rates were wonderful and QE was going to be had. Well, QT and higher rates are showing that's not a free lunch at all. It's quite expensive. What they need to do is be unafraid to drop and break from the trends. And these are a few recommendations how they might do just that.
Thanks, Kevin, very much. Bill, on to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And can I say that I agree with the great majority of the things that Kevin's just said, not least of which is that the fundamental problem we face is a problem of intellectual failure on the part of the central banks. Perhaps I can come back to that in the questions later on. And secondly, I appreciate widening the concern, not just for the economic sphere, but out into the issue of institutional integrity, respect for institutions, and indeed the implications for our democracy itself. So just by way of background. Needless to say, it's an honor to be here today, particularly, I'm not dissing either Kevin or Desmond, but particularly with my old friend, Don Kohn, whom I've known for and respected for so many years. I want to make a few comments that sort of look back in time, because I think what central banks have done in the past has enormous implications for what they can do in the future. But I mostly want to talk about that future. But let me begin with some backward-looking comments. I agree with Kevin and I think some of the others that the Fed and the other central banks do have to bear some responsibility, some significant responsibility for the inflation that we're currently confronting. And when you just look at the numbers, I mean, the sharp reduction in interest rates globally, the massive increase in the size of central bank balance sheets, the massive increase in the US, I think 42% increase in M3 from before the pandemic to the middle of 2022. You don't have to be a monetarist to see that this had the possibility of creating some mischief, okay? So that's been a recent problem. But I want to look further back, and Don knows this because I was saying this in the BIS years and years ago. I've been worried for a long time that the Fed's highly stimulative monetary policy would have important implications for financial instability. And Kevin's already mentioned it, and Alex and Desmond as well. I'll come back to it briefly in a moment. But for the moment, looking back, I want to make a rather different point. And that is that I think the Fed, and for that matter, many of the other central banks as well, have consistently underestimated the importance of supply side problems and supply side fluctuations in the economy. And I start off with the period during the Great Moderation, leading up to the financial crisis, when all one heard from the central banks was that basically we had the Great Moderation because of their wise policies of controlling inflation. And many of us were of the view that the real reason why inflation was decelerating was because of positive supply side shocks, coming out of China, coming out of Eastern Europe, and of course, coming out of the demographics, the baby boom, et cetera, et cetera. So that was sort of the first supply side mistake. The second mistake was during the initial stages of the pandemic, where I think the Fed and others consistently underestimated the magnitude of the destruction of supply potential because of the pandemic and the lockdowns, and that increased the inflationary pressures. And lastly, of course, the Fed, but others as well, also said that these inflationary treasuries were only transitionary and they'd soon go away. And they were wrong on that one too. Now, I'm not bringing attention to these supply side mistakes just to sort of point the finger of blame. What I'm really concerned about is that those mistakes are likely to be repeated in the future, because it seems to me that there's a whole host of negative supply side shocks that are coming down the road and that should really increase our concerns about persistent inflationary pressures. And let me just sort of run through them briefly. First of all, there's the unwinding of all the pre-pandemic resource misallocations. Kevin's last point about the Austrians, they were really concerned about that as a major problem. And I think when you look at all of the zombies and the other companies dependent on cheap financing, the increase in concentration in many industries, the potential for positive supply price increases is coming out of those misallocations is there. Secondly, there's the post-pandemic hysteresis. Downturns always leave scars, but this one could be worse than normal. Think about long COVID. Think about what's going on in China with a zero COVID. Then we've got demographics. Charles Goodhart, my old boss at the Bank of England, and his colleague Praha, written a whole book on this. Pensioners don't produce, but they do consume, and that's inflationary. Then we've got climate change. Mitigation is going to require writing off existing supplies of fossil fuels. Adaptation, collateral damage, going to cut off ports, interrupt supply chains. There's a whole host of these things we have to worry about. Then we've got secularly high commodity prices. Okay? Food is going to be in short supply. Energy is going to be in short supply until we finish the transition. Metals are going to be in short supply. Indeed, it may be impossible to do much of what we want, given the capacity to produce metals. Deglobalization. So there's this whole list of things to worry about. So there's negative supply side shocks. Many people talk about stagflation. This is coming out of the 1970s. The whole idea that you've got a kind of an increase in energy prices that reduces the amount of money you've got to spend on other things. So demand goes down. But when you look at all of those supply side shocks that I'm talking about, they're not leading up to less demand. They're leading up to more demand and more investment in particular. So you think about new supply chains for resilience, response to geographical exigencies. Goodhart and Pradhan argue if you've got fewer workers, you're going to have more investment to replace workers that are in short supply. Mitigating climate change, I won't go on about it. It's obvious to everybody. There's got to be huge investments. And just as a side point here, a lot of this stuff is going to have to be done by governments, okay? And government finance is shaky. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So if my concerns are valid, we face declining supply and increasing demand for investment. And I hope I'm not wrong here, but I think it doesn't take a very big brain to say that if supply is down and investment demand is up, there's only one other thing that's got to give, and that's got to be consumption. And it's as simple as that. Now, the title for this panel is The Fed's Big Inflation Flight. Well, that clearly indicates that somebody thinks the Fed's got a role to play in this, and I certainly feel they do as well. The problem, as Kevin has mentioned, and as was being the theme of previous panels, is that monetary policy now, as it tightens, threatens to disrupt all of those financial stresses that were themselves a byproduct of earlier monetary policy. Past policy containing future policy. And when you look at the numbers, and I won't go into all of them. I don't have so much time, but global debt ratios continued to go up after the great financial crisis. You would have thought it was a time for delevering traditionally, but it didn't happen. A really frightening paper that I think people should read is a recent thing from the McKinsey Global Institute, where they look at the assets in 10 big countries comprising 60% of global GDP. And of those assets, measured assets, 7% of them are productive. Infrastructure, machinery and equipment, and intangibles. We have a massive inverted financial pyramid that is essentially unstable. The quality of debt has declined. The everything bubble that you've already referred to. And lastly, of course, is functioning of financial markets. The markets have become dysfunctional, I think in large part because of the safety net and the associated aspects of that. The most recent thing, of course, has been this LDI thing in the UK. But you remember we had 3 big bouts of this in the Fed market, in the Treasury market. Okay, it's the same kind of stuff. It's all this incredible leveraging, and now it's got to go into reverse, and the liquidity, interestingly enough, is not there too. So we've got some real problems with the Fed tightening further. So I'm sympathetic with Desmond here. I'm also sympathetic with Kevin. I think that the Fed should tighten rates, but they should do so very carefully. On the QT, I'm absolutely less convinced. I think this market functioning problem is a really severe problem, and the Fed should be very careful not to make it even worse by the quantitative tightening. Well, that raises a broader question. If monetary policy, I think we use monetary policy too much over the course of the last 20 years. And I guess what I'm saying is maybe we're in danger of making the same making the same mistake again. We relied on it before, we're going to rely on it now, and it's a big mistake, both with respect to stimulus and restraint. So if you can't use monetary policy, what do you say? Well, I guess I would say fiscal. And when you sort of think about it, if the policy challenge is really to raise investment, well, cutting consumption, it's not so obvious that tight money is the easy way to do, is the right way to do it. We want to encourage a lot of these investments. So I think we should be thinking much more seriously about fiscal restraint. And I say this with humility as a Canadian, but it does seem to me that there's lots of room in the United States for fiscal restraint, mostly in the form of higher taxes, introduce a VAT, higher sin taxes, sharply reduced tax expenditures, particularly mortgage deductibility, tax on fossil fuel. There's a lot of things that can be done, and people should be thinking about it, because monetary policy for these problems is not the answer. All by way of saying, we face some difficult political questions. I think I'm running out of time here now. We're facing some very difficult political problems, because what I'm saying is that for our longer term stability and indeed survival, we need less consumption, we need more investment, and we're going to have fewer resources to work with. So what are we going to do politically? I think the voters have to be
now, Bill, now we are close to the end of the time here.
Okay, I'll finish with this. The voters have to be convinced of the stark reality of the situation. Secondly, the wealthy and the powerful must be convinced to go along with it. It's in their own best interest not to resist. And lastly, the politicians have got to lead again, both in the US and the UK in particular, in spite of doing everything for the benefit of their own re-election as opposed to the common good. Now, that's what needs to happen, but sadly, I think it's not going to happen. And I guess if you wanted my prediction, it's either going to be depression and deflation as this whole thing comes unstuck on the financial side, or it'll be high and lasting inflation as the governments and the central banks throw everything that they've got at it. Now, either of those two things can happen, and they could be happen in either order. But all I can say is, I think this story is not going to end happily without important political changes.
Thanks, Bill, for most interesting comments and also for confirming my prediction that our discussion would not be uplifting. Let's go on to Don.
All right, thanks, Alex, and it's great to be with everyone again, and echo Bill's comments. Great to be recipient of your wisdom again, Bill. So I think what I was going to do is something revolutionary and actually address Desmond's 4 questions until so Alex gives me the hook here. So with most of the comments on question 1, but I'm going to get to the other ones too. So the first question, is the Fed on the right track to bring down inflation, risks of a hard landing? So I do think the Fed is on the right track. I think, Bill, we can get into a discussion. Bill and Kevin seem to have different views of how fast that track should be coming up, but I think it's on the right track. I think they admitted they were wrong. They needed to catch up. And frankly, they've caught up pretty quickly, 375, and we'll get another 75 basis point increase. They're not debating 25 and 50, Kevin. They're debating 50 and 75 and coming down on 75 every time. So they needed to catch up. They've done a lot of catching up. If I look at the financial markets and I look at, say, TIPS, inflation index yields, the 5-year yield is at 160, 165. So I think that our star, and we can come back to this, Bill's comments at the end were very good about investment. But if you think the equilibrium interest rate, as a lot of people do, is something below 1, they've got actual and expected policy in a moderately restrictive stance. I think the other good thing that happened was they admitted that the labor markets are way too tight and they needed to raise the unemployment rate. Now, in their last forecast, they raised it a percentage point, which is not, or they predicted it would need to rise a percentage point to get inflation down, which is not trivial, but only to 4.5%. We can come back to that issue. I think there are risks on both sides of this, the risk of doing too much and the risk of doing not very much. And I come at this seeing the situation as quite complex. I agree with Kevin's points that there is a combination of supply and demand factors at work here, constrained supply and very strong demand. The supply constraints come from COVID, come from the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I think and the demand came from very stimulative policies, both fiscal and monetary policy, and the rapid bounce back once vaccines were available and people felt more comfortable going back into the public. I think it's instructive to me, the complexity of the situation illustrated in part by the fact that high inflation is universal. It's everywhere. So that suggests to me that the supply constraints are important because they're affecting every country. And I saw a piece today that noted that central banks that reacted more quickly and faster and with bigger increases have not had any more success than the central banks that kind of lagged. So it didn't do them any good to see it sooner. And that also suggests there are global supply shocks. I think another aspect of the complexity seems to me is when I think about the 1970s, of course, You think about the 60s and 70s, you think about the political pressure from Johnson and Nixon and the inability or unwillingness of the Fed to do what they needed to do in order to resist that political pressure. But there was also a lot of uncertainty about what was the level of potential GDP and where the labor market could produce without inflation. The Fed greatly underestimated how high the unemployment rate needed to go in order to just keep inflation stable. There was a lot of uncertainty about the response of the economy to changes in interest rates. The Fed overestimated how responsive the economy would be to tighter rates. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there about all this. I do think the labor market is key here. The real supply, the important supply constraint is on labor force participation. In the US, labor force participation has not recovered. It's recovered in prime age workers, but not in retirees. So people over 55 retired early, they're not coming back. There are fewer people in the labor force. There's a strong demand, and that's putting all this pressure on wages. And the wages are feeding through into service prices. And I do worry about a wage price dynamic here, really a wage price dynamic. So workers trying to catch up with the decline in real wages, building that into their wage demands, and then businesses needing to pass that back through the prices. So I think even if there's a slack in labor markets, and there isn't now, not yet, it hasn't happened yet, it'll be a slow disinflationary process. And finally, I think partly, because of their experience and because things are different and don't really fit into any model right now, I think the Fed has completely lost confidence in its forecasts. So it's data dependent. They're reacting very strongly to individual points of data, not best practice. Monetary policy is aimed at the future, not at the past. But for understandable reasons, they don't have confidence in the forecast that inflation will come down. So they're reacting very strongly to the incoming data. And I think that, Desmond, is where the risk of the overshoot comes. So they're reacting to individual pieces of data, looking in the rearview mirror and raising rates quite rapidly. Unless they transition in some way to a more forward-looking policy, they're practically guaranteeing they're going to overshoot. Now, I think they're very aware of this. There's a lot of discussion of lags and issues about lags. But formulating the policy in these very complex, difficult times, I think is going to be hard. They need to downshift the tightening, even as they keep the final where they're going strongly in mind, and their commitment to bringing inflation down. So Desmond's second question was about synchronized tightening and the risk of a global financial market crisis. So I think it's an interesting question, Desmond, because there are some folks who think that when everybody is tightening at the same time, that somehow that adds up to more than usual, like 1 + 1 = 3. I don't quite get that argument. So I think each central bank knows very well what the other central banks are planning to do. They take that into account, the feedback on that. But I do think with everybody tightening at the same time and tightening into these supply disruptions, there is a risk that of a global overshooting here. This is kind of an extension of my comments before for the Federal Reserve. So I do think the synchronized tightening has some risk, and it has risk as Bill was emphasizing, on the in the financial system. Somebody remarked that the Fed that the market reaction was somehow undesirable. I think the Fed's getting exactly what it wants and needs from the markets right now. It's tightening financial conditions. It's having a broad effect across markets, and outside UK pension funds, nothing's broken so far. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't pockets of leverage, as Bill was commenting out there, that might break in the future. I do think we can't let that deflect the Federal Reserve and other central banks from dealing with the inflation problem. So to me, this just argues for more urgency of getting on with the job that was undertaken after March of 2020 and the risk in the non-bank financial system that were identified by that episode, and just start making some changes, start making that financial system more robust, recognizing that you'll never get everything. Some things will happen, but it's taken us such a long time to deal with vulnerabilities that have already been recognized. So we need to get on with that. Your the third question is the surging dollar, and should the Fed take account of its effects on other economies? I would say no is the short answer to that. The Fed should and will take account of the effects of its surging dollar on other economies that it feeds back on the Federal Reserve. But I do think, and the Fed will work with the IMF and other places to help the emerging markets that are hurt by, particularly by these supply shocks, the food shortages, energy price increases, and the surging dollar, to make them more stable. But I think it would be a serious mistake if the Fed backed off of the tightening policy and didn't find the global financial system needs a stable United States. It is at the core, still at the core of the system. And they've got price stability in the US must be a prerequisite, is a prerequisite for stability in the global system. It's not enough, it's necessary, but not sufficient, but it is necessary. So they've got to keep going. And your final question was, in light of policy mistakes, what lessons should we draw about what might be needed to prevent a future episode of high inflation and asset price bubbles? I don't have easy answers there. A couple points. One is, I do think there needs, and this is maybe our next panel for 6 months or a year from now, I think there needs to be an examination of what went wrong. What went wrong in the forecast, and then what went wrong once the Fed realized the forecasts were wrong, how they could have reacted more robustly to that realization. So I think it's both a forecasting issue and a policy issue. I think I draw some hope from the fact that the Fed has said they're going to have every 5 years a review of their framework that Kevin noted. So they should be doing I would think a lessons learned was a prerequisite for a framework review. That's due in 2024 for publication 2025. I've suggested to people inside the Federal Reserve, not gotten very positive feedback, that they start that a year early, that they do that in 2023, maybe in the second half of 2023, so they can get at it earlier. When I've talked to central bankers, and not just people in the Fed, but lots of central bankers, about doing lessons learned, they say it's too early. We don't know yet, but we don't know how this is going to turn out. But I don't think it's too early. And certainly by the middle of next year, it won't be too early to know whether they're getting any kind of decline in inflation that all these central bankers seem to be looking for. And my second high level 30,000.
Tom, at that point, let me tell you that the time is up, so you need to wrap up here in a minute.
Okay, so my second one is that I think you need to prepare for the possibility that history won't repeat itself. that the next war won't look like the last war. So the Fed built their Maginot Line against the experience of the 2010s. And the low inflation, difficulty getting inflation up to 2, the ability to push the economy, unemployment rate way down without much inflation consequences. And that's not, obviously, that's not what happened. And I have a sense that they were so focused on the 2010 to 2019 experience that they didn't even think about or contemplate how they might react if that situation was changed. So I think you need to always be thinking about what might go wrong and how you deal with that. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Don, for very interesting comments. And I particularly think we have to deal with this problem you pointed out, that none of the models seems to be working. Give us some wisdom, perhaps, about our ability to model such things. And Desmond, on your point about the Fed's balance sheet, I'm going to just steal 15 seconds to say composition of a balance sheet. I think that the model, or that the target, should not be fewer mortgages. It should be no mortgages. And we ought to go back to the wisdom that the central bank should not be financing the mortgage market on its own balance sheet, as, say, William McChesney Martin would have insisted on. Anyway, with that, let me go on to Desmond. Also congratulating you, Desmond, for putting a great panel together. Desmond. Desmond, you may.
Yeah, I'm just loading my slides, and rather than being congratulated for putting a great panel together, I should really thank the panel for a rich discussion. You know, and I agree with a lot of what the previous speakers have said, but I guess when I put it all together, I can't help feeling that the Fed is engaging in overkill, and that the Fed is going at far too rapid a pace, and that they'd be well advised to slow down the pace, to pause, to see what the effect of their policy has been, you know, before they just continue to tighten. So let me just indicate that I believe that there are at least 4 reasons, you know, when I put it all together, that leads me to think that the same way that the Fed was too slow to raise interest rates, now they're going in the other direction. They're tightening at far too rapid a pace. So the 4 reasons that I'd put forward are that we've got a very rapid pace of monetary policy tightening that takes time for that to work, you know, so that there's a question of the lags. The second point is that one needs to look at the context within which the tightening is occurring. It's occurring at a time that fiscal policy is shifting in the opposite direction, that fiscal policy is tightening as well. You know, we've gone from fiscal policy ease to fiscal policy tightening. We've got the dollar rising, and we've got the world economy in a very poor state. The third point that I'd want to make is that we're already seeing evidence that the United States economy is slowing. And the last point, you know, which I think is really important, and, you know, talks to Bill's point, you know, which I share, is that if you go too fast on the interest rates, what you're going to do is you're going to burst all of these bubbles in a very quick way. And then the last of our problems, at least short run, is going to be inflation. We're going to be dealing with, you know, another 2008 sort of situation. So let me just run through those points rather quickly, just through illustrating with some slides. You know, the first point is just look at the pace at which they're tightening. This slide is showing previous episodes of tightening, and you just see that the pace at which the Fed is going is really very rapid, that we haven't seen anything like this. You know, I think you've got to go back to the Volcker period to see tightening at this kind of pace. But what's occurring as well is that you're not only raising interest rates, but they're reducing the size of their balance sheet at a terrific rate. You know, they're now going at $95 billion a month. I'm not sure that I understand doing this when the financial markets are on the back foot. You know, that really seems to be inviting trouble. And then that if you look at what's happening to mortgage rates, you know, they're going through the roof. You know, we've gone from 3% to 7% in a short space of time. It means somebody who could buy a $400,000 house at the beginning of the year can now only buy a $300,000 house on a mortgage. You know, that really has to mean that trouble lies ahead. So I just think that we've really got to wait to see what the effect of this is, you know, before we march forward, you know, with further 75 basis point hikes. Now, just to add to that, that not only is the Fed tightening at a very rapid rate, but it's doing so at a time that fiscal policy has gone from terrific ease to tightening. You know, this is the chart that you see. 2020, we had all of the spending, and now we're shifting down to a more normal period. So you've got fiscal policy withdrawal. And I thought that this chart from the IMF really tells it all. You know, that what you're seeing on the one axis is the monetary policy tightening, but the other is the fiscal policy tightening. And you're just seeing the United States is in a world of its own, you know, that they both slamming on the fiscal brakes and the monetary policy brakes at the same time. You know, so I think that that really has to be taken into account. I've mentioned that you've got the dollar. That's another thing that is adding to drag. You know, it's got to add in time. It's got to be putting down deflationary pressure. So when you look at financial market conditions, you know, we're seeing that they're tightening pretty abruptly. So let me go to the third point, is that we're seeing signs of the US economy slowing. GDP in the first couple of quarters, what that did is it actually declined. So you've got the economy that's already flat. And then, you know, when you look at what's happening in housing, you know, you just can't help feeling that we've already got a big recession waiting for us in the housing market. You'll see house prices coming down pretty sharply next year. All of this, once again, operates with a lag. Last point that I'd make is, you know, just the point that Bill has addressed is that we've really got the world is at record debt levels. So, you know, to begin messing around, you know, tightening too much, you've got a huge amount of leverage in the system, you know, that just the same way we found the pension system in the UK was over leveraged, we're bound to find plenty of dead bodies floating pretty soon. We've already seen the stock market, the bond market really being hit. You know, you keep raising interest rates at a rapid rate, go into recession. You know, we've got further pain lying ahead. You know, and this chart is just showing that, you know, the credit markets really got way out of whack. You know, you had spreads tightening got too tight. Now they're blowing out. You know, you're bound to get financial market damage. So the last point, you know, I mentioned that in the introduction. You know, I'd say once again, you know, it seems to me that there are early warning signs that things are coming apart in the credit market. You know, we've had China defaulting on its debt. They've got a property bubble that makes that in the United States look mild, you know, the one in 2008. So you'll get a lot more pressure there. You've had the Bank of England having to bail out the pension funds. I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of other instances like that. You know, we'll see who's been swimming naked. You've had in Europe, you've had Credit Suisse, and now you've got the emerging markets defaulting like crazy. So just to sum up, you know, I think the Fed needs to take into account the lags in its policy, that this takes time. They've got to look at the fragility of the financial markets, and they've also got to take into account the international context. You know, we really got a synchronized global slowing that Europe is about to be hit into a big recession because of the natural gas cutoff. The emerging markets are defaulting on their debt, and we've got China that's got a property bubble and a zero COVID. So you're just getting slowing all over the place, and if the Fed goes too fast, this is really, I think that you do have to take into account the international situation, much the same way as Lehman spread abroad. Problems abroad can come back to hammer our financial markets. It just struck me that a third of the United States corporate earnings come from abroad, so one really can't be discounting that in terms of what it has on the financial markets. So I'll leave it there, Alex.
Thank you, Desmond, and thanks to all for great comments. A lot of interesting ideas. I'd like to go back through the panel in the same order as we did before, and you get 2 minutes, absolute maximum 3 minutes, to reply to anything anybody else has said or add other ideas of your own. And Kevin, we'll start again with you.
All right. Thanks, Alex. So let me be clear and blunt. We have all the makings of a global recession, point one. Point two, I think we would be quite fortunate is if it went from the disequilibrium in which we found ourselves for a long period of time into some new equilibrium in a straight line. I think the most important words I heard from my friend Don Kohn was, we haven't had too many manifestations of this financial instability so far. We might have said that right after Bear Stearns in the spring of 2008 as well. So that's the situation. Both the modal outlook, I think, is deteriorating, and the tails look thicker and fatter and uglier than at any other point in my lifetime. Milton Friedman said in 1978, never in his lifetime to that point had he been in a moment with more danger and more hope than 1978. Well, I will resuscitate that for this moment. So what to do about it? I think that as the Fed has raised rates, expectations were that they'd have to keep going because they keep following the same old playbook. So my suggestion isn't raise rates more faster, just the same way you've been going, but go faster. It's quite the opposite. With risks on all sides, you need to change regimes. What matters is not just the policies you choose, but how you coordinate those policies with the rest of the world central banks, how you coordinate those policies with your fiscal authorities, and how you share this knowledge with the broad public and financial markets. I think if we were to believe that the Fed was a stern master rather than a fickle master, then you guys are right. We will raise rates too much and do great harm. That's why I suggest a regime change means throw out the way you've been doing business, throw out this behavior that got you into this mess, and that after 6 or 7 months of raising has certainly not solved the problem as immaculately as your forecast would have you believe. Change how you go to market, throw out the dots, throw out the forecasts, work with the G7, the G10 and G20, decide what you're going to want to do. And after you do a big move, which you describe as internally as the least you'd expect to do in the next 4 to 6 months, you'll get a question from reporters. Well, what are you going to do next? Answer, I don't know. We'll just see about that. Get markets to start to understand that you're breaking this inflation psychology. So that's my broad second point. Third, Don said something about, well, look at TIPS spreads, and they seem quite well behaved. I'll just introduce to my dear friend Don something which is between 2019, January of 2019 and December of 2021, what percentage of the index bonds in the United States did the Federal Reserve buy relative to net issuance? Answer, 138%. The TIPS markets are telling me nothing. We should not overread any measure of that. You simply have to go across the street and get a cup of coffee and ask the person who serves you coffee, what do you think about inflation? And you'll get the answer to that riddle. So I don't think we need to be looking to these markets that we polluted. And as a final comment, if I have time in my 2 to 3 minutes, Alex.
You have 15 seconds.
Don said, well, those that have raised rates sooner found no particular improvement in their inflation dynamics. Don knows better than that. Inflation acts with long and variable lags, and these guys have been going at this for 6 months. Secondly, Don notes a final point, which is the international spillovers are not just in policy, they're intellectual. And if you believe what Don said, and I do, the US is the dominant economic engine here. Inflation is being driven globally in large part by what the Federal Reserve is doing.
Thanks, Kevin. Bill, 3 minutes.
Yeah, just two points. One of them, I can't remember, was Don, somebody said that Kevin and I disagreed, that he seems to want to go faster, and I and Desmond, I think, want to go a bit slower. I'll tell you the fundamental reason why these disagreements might be legitimate is because there's just enormous uncertainty about the implications of doing either policy. So I was just thinking the dangers of tightening, rapidly. So what's going to happen to the financial sector? Oh, you don't know. What's going to happen to the financial markets? This QT and all this kind of stuff, and all the ructions that we've already seen in the markets. We don't know. But on the other hand, you sort of say, well, what are the dangers of not tightening? Well, there's huge uncertainty about the part rate, huge uncertainty about the slope of the Phillips curve, and huge uncertainty about whether the degree to which inflationary expectations are anchored. And I certainly respect Kevin's statement that, bold moves might reestablish that credibility. I think, in a sense, in the Volcker years, we saw that. But on the other hand, I'm thinking about some of this recent work by Kevin Rudd and others that indicate that people's inflationary expectations have basically got nothing to do with targets established by the central bank, in spite of our our hope that it might be so. So that's my first point. There's huge amounts of uncertainty here, and maybe some bold gambles will have to be taken. The second point I wanted to raise was the questions that we should have learned from not just the pandemic, the inflation pandemic, but the great financial crisis. The lesson that we should have learned is that the central banks have made a fundamental philosophical error. They have misunderstood the nature of the system that they're trying to control. They think it is understandable and it is controllable and it is fundamentally linear. And it is not. The system is what is referred to as a complex adaptive system. This is recognized in virtually every other discipline you can imagine, except for reasons that escape me, economics. It is a complex adaptive system. These things break down all the time. They have nonlinear properties, and we have to embrace that complexity. And I think, and indeed I've written about this, there are many very simple lessons that you can learn once you just embrace the concept. One of which is they always break down, so be prepared, okay? And we aren't. Secondly, you can't maximize, you don't know enough about it, so you should mini-max, i.e. your concern should be about avoiding doing really stupid things, as President Obama said, as opposed to trying to drag the last dollar of GDP out of the system. It's beyond our capacities. And I could give you a dozen other lessons, but I won't do it right now.
Thanks, Bill. Don, comments?
I don't have much to add. I think we should be great to get on to the audience questions here. I just, I guess for Kevin, talked about the credibility of the central bank and how it had eroded, and also said if you went across the street and asked the guy selling the coffee about inflation, of course they'd say we hate it. What's interesting is that when you ask them what's inflation going to be, it's down. So and the financial markets themselves have, in my mind, have been much too optimistic over this time period about what monetary policy will take to keep inflation very close to the 2% target. I don't understand where they got it, but they certainly were there. So I think in the long-term inflation expectations, whether you ask the people in the barber shop in the Michigan survey or the people on Wall Street in the markets, they're still pretty well anchored around 2%. Now, I think the Fed has lost intellectual credibility, which is, I think, a lot of what Kevin was talking about, because it was so wrong on the inflation forecast. But I do give them credit for admitting it, moving rapidly and keeping the credibility really that they're going to get inflation back into the 2% zone. One comment on Bill, I agree, Bill, with your points about supply side issues that are facing the global economy here. And I think they'll have two effects. One is this investment effect. That'll raise R-star, that'll raise the real interest rate that's necessary to equilibrate aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And I think some of the other ones, the globalization, et cetera, or deglobalization will probably raise the unemployment rate that's necessary to keep inflation low. I agree with you that I think a lot of this experience from 2000 to 2019 can be viewed as a lot of a favorable supply shock. And that's not there, and there appear to be some unfavorable ones. Having said all that, central banks are still responsible for inflation over time. So it might require higher interest rates, probably will require higher interest rates and a higher unemployment rate for the reasons Bill points out, but that doesn't mean that we have to live with inflation.
Thanks, Don. Desmond, comments?
Yeah, I guess the way I'm seeing it is that we really have a perfect economic storm, that as the US is trying to slow down, we've got Europe on the cusp of a very deep recession, because of an energy supply shock. We've got China with its property problems, means that they're not going to be growing. We've got the emerging markets that are in really very bad shape. And at the same time, we've got all of these asset price and credit price markets that are likely, those bubbles are likely to burst. So I'm not sure that I see the inflation as being, if we look into where we're going to be in 23, if we have a very deep global recession, you're going to get the inflationary pressures coming off. I think that the real challenge, and probably there's not a whole lot that they can do about it, because they gave us multi-decade inflation and they gave us bubbles at the same time. So there's not an easy way out. I think where the thought should go is, how do you prevent this occurring the next time around? And it would seem to me that you really need to get more support from fiscal policy. You can't have everything put onto the central banks, but then you've got a political system that doesn't afford you that possibility. So the central bank really gets stuck into a ridiculous situation where they just repeat, they get you out of the mess, but they get you out of the mess at the price of creating yet another big bubble. So I don't know that I can offer you much optimistic on this view, but I think that the short-term outlook, I don't see how, if you've got this perfect economic storm and you've got all of these mispricing in credit and asset markets, I don't see how this ends happily. I don't see that inflation is going to be their big problem.
Thanks, Desmond. And speaking of storms, as we were talking a little bit before the conference started, we noticed that we have a 100-year storm every 10 years as we go through this. Let me come to the questions from the audience. We have a lot of them. Thank you, members of the audience. And it really makes me wish we were all in person so we could have the in-person interchange. I'm not sure how many of these we can get through, but let's begin. Indra Klein asks, and this is a question for any or all of the panel: is it realistic to expect interest rates to return to the low rates pre-pandemic and pre the geopolitical upheavals we've got? And we think we're going back to pre-2020 situation? Anybody? Bill?
I would suggest that we might go back to very low rates, but we'll go back for different reasons. That we had very low rates because the Fed and the central banks were pushing the rates down in the interest of getting inflation up, which frankly I think was an odd policy, but nevertheless that was the policy that was followed. But if we're going to look forward to a world in which we're going to have slower supply growth because of all of these potential problems, then in some longer run sense, the natural rate will be lower. And that's where we'll go back to. But in the interval, of course, as you are trying to adjust from aggregate demand growth, which is too fast relative to the underlying supply potential, the real rates will have to rise. So they'll rise and then over time will go back down. But that might extend beyond the period of time in which I will be an active observer.
Alex,
Desmond?
yeah, on my view of the world, we're going to see very low interest rates next year. You know, we'll go back to where we were before. It'll just be something like we see occurred after 2008, you know, that the central banks will really need to juice the thing up, you know, globally. So my betting would be that treasury bonds are going to have a huge rally.
I mean, we could answer this question either in a descriptive or normative way. As a descriptive matter, I think Desmond's probably right, which is we've been running boom and bust monetary for a long time, and so rates overshoot in both directions. But as a normative matter, I hope we don't end up in a world where we go back to zero rates and the Fed aggregating its balance sheet still larger and larger. I hope we haven't crossed the Rubicon, so the central bank becomes the appeals court for broken fiscal, regulatory, and climate policy and everything else. But I fear that that unless we change gears, reframe the objective function of the Fed, then we're going to have rates that are both too high and too low. And if we can listen to pay heed to anything, we should just simply recognize that when interest rates are too high, they do great harm to demand. And when interest rates are too low, they do great harm to supply. And that's part of the reason why the supply side of the economy looks to me not to be as robust as it should be.
We're not going to make a dot plot with this panel, but Don, you want to add anything?
No, I don't think I have anything to add there. I think we don't know. I thought that some of the things Bill pointed out actually would result in higher interest rates, particularly all that investment for climate change, a higher R star. And if the demographics go to we older people who should be retired, spending down our wealth, that also will add to R star. So I think it's who knows. It's one of those Kevin was talking about the fat tails. And I think we just don't know. But it does mean that the central banks are going to have to be quite nimble and flexible in judging how these things come about.
In short, as always, plenty of uncertainty. Bill, Jane Johnson has a question about your comments, and anybody else can comment too. She says, William White calls for tighter fiscal policy and tax increases and claims the public must be made to understand the need, but for some time the entire country has been in a modern monetary theory. By the way, I claim that should be written with quotes, quote, modern, unquote, monetary theory, since there's no older idea than printing up the money. Anyway, in a modern monetary theory mode, thinking government spending can continue indefinitely. So how is this going to happen? And I think you already said you don't think it will happen, or maybe even can happen.
Yeah, I think the point is a valid one, that if the starting point in terms of false beliefs is really at the opposite end of the spectrum of true belief, then you've got a big gap to overcome. And what we know with respect to beliefs, and I'm referring back to, let's say, Thomas Kohn, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is that even in normal times, it's very difficult to get people to change their minds. And Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, makes the point, which is not intuitive, but I think is true, is that when your beliefs are challenged by something that is totally inexplicable, given your analytical framework, far from questioning your framework, you delve deeper into it. And so it becomes more and more difficult to change things. And that is what I'm worried about. And going back to, Kevin's comments and others, the difficulty is that if we don't do the things that need to be done to convince people of things that will work, And in the current circumstances, I fear this means higher taxes and adjustments on the part of the rich and the powerful, that if we don't get that, this will not end with an everlasting cycle of interest rates too high and too low. It will end in the Latin American solution, because that's where it always ends. These systems are fundamentally unstable, and if they are fundamentally unstable, they will collapse, and they'll take our democracy with it. So this stuff is very important, and I just wish that there were less uncertainty about not only what should be done, but in fact what could or would be done, given the false beliefs that people currently have.
Thank you. Other comments on this one?
So I'm actually a little bit encouraged by the UK situation, because a terrible proposal was made on the fiscal side. They were punished by the markets. They have to draw back. And I thought the prime minister's, I almost called him chancellor, the prime minister's comments today were, we've got to put debt on a sustainable basis. We can't put this on future generations. I think for too long, we've been living in a world in which the interest rate was low relative to the growth rate. It looked like a free lunch. We're out of that world. We're not in that world anymore. And maybe the market discipline will help discipline the policymakers. I like Bill's policy prescriptions for fiscal policy, but it's going to take a while to get both parties to agree on raising taxes on consumption in the United States.
Yeah.
Maybe I can just drop in, Alex, a quick fiscal statistic. We just ended a fiscal year here in the United States. And if we were to compare that to the 12 months prior to COVID, for a reasonable benchmark, just to note two statistics. Federal government spending is 32% larger. That is, the federal government is 32% larger than it was in that full 12 months prior to COVID. That sounds like a pretty big government to me. But the thing that might surprise you more is tax revenue over the last fiscal year is 42% higher than tax revenue was in those 12 months going into that March day in 2020. So the revenues are our gusher, and even still, we have a deficit this year of about $1.4 trillion. So Don is encouraged, perhaps, that the bond vigilantes came to Britain there, but for the grace of the US dollar go we.
Desmond.
Yeah, I'm also very encouraged, like Don, about the bond vigilantes getting UK policy back on track. But at the same time that was occurring, they were giving a third term to somebody whose policies were totally misguided. I'm talking about President Xi. So we're not going to get a correction. If anything, we're going to get entrenchment in China. And that is really very bothersome, that you've got the second, we're not talking about the UK now, we're talking about the second largest economy in the world, is likely to be on a very slow growth track for a long while, which is going to have huge global implications.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Bill. Then I'm going to come to the next question.
I just wanted to follow up on Don's comment about the UK, with which I entirely agree. The bond markets gave them a message, and they received the message, and that's good. But there is another side to it too, which is that in the end, the Bank of England had to step into the market and do quantitative, although they don't want to call it that, had to increase the size of their balance sheet, whatever you want to call it, when they were committed to reducing the size of their balance sheet. And the question that it raises, is there a longer run conflict between maintaining financial stability and maintaining price stability? And I think that's a question that's circulating in the minds of a lot of people as we speak.
That's a good one. Let me come to it now. It is almost 3:30, but I'd like to let us go a little bit over time with Desmond's permission to take up maybe one or two more questions. We have a question from Bert Ely. Yesterday's Financial Times published an article headlined, "A political backlash against monetary policy is looming. Maybe something seriously wrong with monetary policy." How much do you worry, or should we worry, about political backlashes against the central banks?
I think it's always worth, you always need to worry about that. And nothing is more important to the central banks than explaining themselves clearly and understandably to the legislators so they know, and telling a credible story, back to Kevin's points, that that they understand and will support your policy. I think so far in the US, I don't see a backlash. We had an episode, 4 years of Donald Trump yelling at the Fed to lower, well, 3 years until they got back to zero, right? Yelling at the Fed to lower interest rates. And I thought the Congress backed the Fed pretty well, and that Chair Powell did a good job of ignoring all that yelling and screaming. But I do worry that as unemployment rates rise, that the populist swing in politics here, both far right and far left populist swing, will come to rest on the central bank. So they need to keep that price stability goal firmly in mind and be able to explain how their actions are getting there and will benefit the economy over time. But the pressure will mount for sure. I remember many episodes sitting behind Alan Greenspan and having him being yelled at by a lot of senators from both parties for his monetary policies. And he stuck to them, I'm thinking in the 90s, early 90s. And that's what the Fed will need to do. But there's more pressure coming for sure.
And many presidents and Federal Reserve chairman or finance or other central bank governors before that. We should remember that Paul Volcker, now heroic in retrospect or even sainted in his day, had tremendous political backlash against his policies. Now in retrospect, all praised. It was very violent and vitriolic. Anyway, other comments on political backlash?
Yeah, Alex, just it would seem to me that political backlash is inevitable, because the Fed is likely to have failed on both parts of its mandate. That first they gave us multi-decade inflation, and if I'm right, they're going to have given us a very deep economic recession and high unemployment. So, I don't see how they're not going to be subject to a lot of political pressure, for huge mistakes that they made I think that the mistake that they made in 2021 was to be totally asleep at the wheel, to allow money supply to increase by 40% over a 2-year period to keep interest rates low when inflation is picking up, to delude themselves that it was transitory, that there's going to be a lot of accounting.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question and then we'll stop. Ricardo Rosenberg writes, please comment on Professor Jeremy Siegel's view the Fed is not placing sufficient weight on the long lag in rent and home prices and misses thereby the right reading of the CPI. How do we think about real estate prices and CPI in this situation, where we have, as I said, the biggest asset there is, namely real estate.
Well, in August of 2020, the Fed, in a big rollout in Jackson Hole, announced their new regime. And their new regime basically said that policy would be inert until they fully achieved their inflation objective and their, quote, inclusive employment objective. So that's the moment at which they decided to discard probably the only thing that the profession could have agreed on in the last 40 years, and that we'd all agree on readily on this call, which is there's long and variable lags. So I'm not surprised all of a sudden, having announced that regime, that they could be committing the sin in the other direction.
Other thoughts? All right. We're nearing the end. Anybody have a final shot they want to take? Advising the world or the central banks or just your fellow panelists? No? All right, then we'll adjourn. Thank you very much for outstandingly interesting comments and discussion. And to the members of the audience, thank you all for being with us. And thank you, Desmond, for setting this all up.